Welcome to Village Squarecast. This is a very special Village Squarecast because our very special guest is our very own Liz Joyner. And a lot of folks, I'm not going to say take Liz for granted, but in a way, we got. I thought it would be very, very special. Oh, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Corey.
An
Sometimes,
important part of the
yeah.
conversation.
Sometimes you hear me before the podcast and after the podcast, but here I am on the regular podcast and I get to moderate and interview our very own Liz. So it's not that we take Liz Joyner for granted. It's just that she does so much. She's almost ubiquitous with this organization that I thought we all thought it would be a good idea to have Liz as the special guest.
Everyone
So
except Liz thought that, right?
that's right. That's right. So with that, our special guest, Liz Joyner, is the founder and CEO of the Village Square. For Friends of the Village Square, did you know that this very organization was named by former U.S. Senator Olympia Snowe as one of 8 organizations to support if you're concerned about the deepening partisan divide? Liz has a master's degree in social work, conceptualizing Village Square. After her experience working in politics convinced her that the way we work out our disagreements in today's public square is fundamentally flawed. She was nominated by Leadership Tallahassee as Leader of the Year in 2010, named by Tallahassee Democrat as one of 25 women you need to know in 2015, by the Girl Scouts as a Woman of Distinction in 2016, and was honored by United Church Women as a Woman of Peace. She's also a Knight Foundation Fellow, a participant in the 2015 Conclave on Political Polarization, and will soon be designated as an Ashes Chaya, a Woman of Valor, by my dear old dad's synagogue. But I bet Liz didn't even know that last part, did you?
Oh, that's pretty great. You should have led with that, Corey. That's an honor.
That is a special honor, which means that you'll be invited to the next Passover Seder if we happen to be in the same town at the same same time.
That's pretty fabulous. I think I need to make sure I'm in the same town.
It's a ton of fun, especially if my parents, who are full on New York Jewish, and they're leading the Seder. Phyllis is just she is what almost every sitcom Italian or Jewish mother is based on. So
Oh, that's fabulous.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's great. That's the way I like them. My mom 2.0 growing up, that
There you go.
describes her. So
Well, that's a great segue. So I was really curious. You grew up in the DC area where your dad worked at the Pentagon. Was your mom in politics as well, or worked for government?
no, she was a stay-at-home mom, and they used to tease every time election came around. They said that they were going to cancel each other out, and they marched to the polls and voted for opposite candidates way, way back in the day. So that had something to do probably with how I got here. I kind of find that a lot of people in this space have family members who believe different things about politics.
Yeah. I was curious about that. I'd heard that you have a brother that was a Navy SEAL. I've heard you describe yourself as left of center politically, even though this organization is nonpartisan and you're
Right.
very, very careful to keep it so. Um, did you have other brothers and sisters, or just your brother?
I also have a sister.
Okay. And does everyone fall a little bit differently politically? I was curious what the what those family dinners looked like in the DC area growing up in your family's house.
So it's weird because I would say that mostly we were characterized by we're a public service family. And I wouldn't say that I thought we talked about politics all that much. Um, it'd be outside of that, right? And I do think it was a different time in that people weren't really highly identified around their political beliefs. Interesting, I would say that a childhood experience was really formative for me. In fact, some ways I kind of feel like the Village Square is the house that Vic Gold built. And that is the dad of my best friend growing up, and he was very involved in politics, and his politics were different than mine. He worked for good friends with the Bush family, and he was actually Agnew's press secretary up to a certain point in time.
Oh, wow.
And so the conversations that we would have about civic life and ideas and politics at the Gold's house, while different from my own, were riveting. And fascinating. And Mr. Gold was just animated, and he had these just really strong beliefs around politics. But we'd have these, we'd dive in, and everyone had these different ideas, and it was passionate. And then when the conversation was over, it would be like, Mr. Gold made it clear that we were all good friends and that there was an amazing amount of respect between us people who disagreed. And I think having seen it early on in my life and between people who have foundational respect for each other and just, his role modeling, I think, made me very disquieted when I felt like that wasn't what our civic environment was anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So were some of those conversations, is that what inspired you to study what you, because you studied social work in undergrad?
I did. It's hard for me to know. I guess I've sort of always been kind of a peacemaker. But my specialization was I studied psychology undergrad, and then graduate school I got a degree in social work, and my specialization was in family therapy. So systems therapy, sort of how families fit together as units, and how sometimes there's dysfunctions that hurt everyone. And so I would say that I just graduated to a very large family
I
when
was
I
gonna say,
started the Village Square.
I was gonna say, I mean, that must have been good prep for politics.
It kind of is, yes, it was. And actually so many the way that we've come to see so many of the challenges we have is it's systemic, right? It's you push here and something changes that you don't really expect to. And there's equal and opposite reactions in kind of a dysfunctional system. And so it's maybe a little bit more like it than I wish it were.
Yeah. Yeah. So you after college, went for a graduate degree, uh, but you didn't start Village Square right away. What were some of the jobs that you've had along the way?
Um, so my first jobs were inpatient psychiatric jobs. And so that was when I sort of learned my trade. I was under the wing of psychiatrists and clinical social workers to learn how to do therapy. But it was in an inpatient setting. So people who were in real desperate emergencies and crisis in their lives. And then my next job was working in the Second Judicial Circuit, where we were legal guardians of adults who had been adjudicated incompetent for various reasons. And so that too was, sort of being involved in systems that were complex and challenging. I've always been my early hero was Dr. King, and I would read every book I could get my hands on about his life. And growing up in the shadow of the March on Washington, and I just always that always spoke to my soul. Probably had a lot to do with my choice of career. And then I became a mom. And so it wasn't until after I was a mom and our politics seems to have gone further and further south that I had this harebrained idea.
So I have some follow-up questions. One is, for those who've really deeply read Dr. King's work, were you did you also pull on some of the theological threads? Because as you commented, our politics has fallen off, not fallen off a cliff, but it's really degenerated in a lot of ways. And part of what we're looking at is that intersection of politics and theology, or politics and religion. Uh, but the theology of a Christian, a deeply rooted Christian like Dr. King, looks very different than a lot of the more prominent, say, evangelicals of today. Did you dive into that at all?
So I would say that I didn't know, I didn't start there. So I don't give myself a ton of credit for having conceptualized this thing all the way out. I didn't start there, but I definitely have come back around to it.
Yeah.
I think as a young person, his his belief in who we could be together as a country, living into those highest ideals that were birthed with the Declaration um and the Constitution, but were not it, the promissory note, right, that he describes. I think that those things together spoke deeply to my soul at the time. And I think that it's only later that I started to really understand the depths of his wisdom that were spiritual. And in many ways, I think King, as I also think our framers, um, which I can kind of consider him one of,
Yeah.
um, were incredible students of human nature, and I think Dr. King came by that through his faith as well. Uh, he understood humans. He understood that kind of the challenge that was ahead of him, and the sort of high plateau that people had to rise to, and the anger they had to overcome, right, to be able to keep moving that vision of who we could be together forward. It's really hard to do, right? I mean, his cause was righteous, and yet still, as we know from, our another hero of mine, Dr. Jonathan Haidt, you know,
I was just thinking of height. Yeah. My next question is sort of about that.
humans, we are righteous. We tend to come at problems like this you know by not necessarily our own best behavior, right? And so he would sit. We have had the pleasure of having a program about Patricia Stevens Dew, who is one of the most amazing civil rights leaders that you may not have known about, and she was local to our Tallahassee community, but she was involved in one of the first jail-ins. And it's only through studying her work that I understood what King did. He taught these young people how to succeed in this incredibly extraordinary task ahead of them in a way that we have continued to use as a model in the work we do.
So you mentioned Jonathan Haidt. I was also thinking of some other guests that you've had on, and you're an avocational student of great sociologists of our time. Arthur Brooks comes to mind.
Yes.
The other John, not the other John, but our mutual friend John. I just blanked. I'm going to have to edit this out. You know who I'm talking about, Jonathan
Rausch.
Rausch. Thank you.
Yeah, say that again.
I can't believe I blanked on it. I didn't take my brain pills this morning. Um, and our another great student of what's happening in our time, John Rausch. So
Who is extraordinary.
it is extraordinary. A Constitution of Knowledge should be a textbook that's studied in every high school and college civics class, I think.
Agree completely.
Yeah. So with your background in psychology, psychiatry, combined with that sociological avocational engagement, what would you say that we're suffering from a greater degree of, I won't say pure mental illness, but mental fragility in a way? Like we're closer to that being sick as a populace, and in all of us individually, or is it something that we're just more aware of and there's more diagnoses? What are your thoughts about that?
So I think that the evolution and some really major trends in society, which we're all suffering under. So, in the digital environment, it's so great that you and I can hang out with each other from across the country, but there's a lot of other things that come with that digital environment. And we're in an environment where it's much harder for us to be healthy. It's much harder for us to find the things that really do feed human souls. And largely that's each other. Um, and so we're having a crisis of belonging, a crisis of understanding, as we are increasingly, behind our keyboards, and our relationships with each other are distant. And so yeah, I think that I think we're all sort of experiencing a really understandable kind of mass human tragedy
Yeah.
that we're doing the wrong things to work our way out of. We seem to like be believing that somehow if only those people were just neutralized, if they weren't there here, and that if we were doing exactly what it is we thought was the right thing to do, then we'd all be fine. When really we need more of quote unquote those people in our lives,
Yeah.
because I mean, going along with John Roush's thesis, which I really deeply believe that, we all can only see a part of the whole. And we need people who see things really differently than us to be able to understand things better. But then at a very deep and human level, we need those relationships in our lives in a way that we aren't right now. And
Yeah.
and so to me, it's very, this is fixable. It's fixable, but we're doing all the wrong things in
Well,
our minds to fix it.
I want to dive into this a little bit more, but before we move on from a little bit about your background and your personal story, I've heard, but I haven't seen that you something about your hobby, something about quilts or something. Is I was curious what your hobbies are, and if I'm right about the whole quilt thing. Tell me more about that, how that came about, and any other hobbies that folks might not know about.
Man, you do your homework, Corey Nathan.
That's what you pay me the big bucks for.
Yeah. Um, so as so I used to, although there's just not enough time anymore, but I used to actually dye my own fabric. I would do things like doing like you know how you can expose the sun to fabric or paper, and I think it's called cyanotyping. And it turns fabric blue around in white around designs. And I would do dyeing. I would then cut it into little pieces and make quilts out of them. And relative to this work, I would say my opus was a huge American flag. It's like 5 by 7 feet. I actually made two of them, one for each of our daughters. And it was to honor our family members who had served in, and in some cases died in service to the country. And so I took rubbings of my father-in-law's name off the Vietnam Wall. I took my father, my grandfather, and my brother's commission papers, and they're all sort of woven into that quilt, which I called Threads of a Nation. However, I do not still do that because I'm kind of metaphorically stitching things together these days.
Okay. Any other hobbies? Anything else that's secret that I wasn't able to dig up?
I'm trying to think. No, this has been pretty much,
That's
not
your thing.
24/7, but I do like to sleep.
Yeah. So
Um,
I have a related question. I've never asked this kind of a question of anyone, but of you, I was really curious how you would answer it. I call it the universal, truly universal bridging divides question. Um, and if I'm taking you off guard, we can certainly come back to it at the end.
okay.
If citizens from a far off universe, not Earth, were to come down to Earth and consider the possibility that the human species was just too much trouble and needed to be exterminated, but you were a diplomat and you were making a case for humanity, how would you go about that? You can use a rhetorical argument, history, sketches from history, cultural artifacts, theological premises, anything you like. How might you do that?
All right, so I'm going to jump right into it. I might think of a better argument later, so I'm going to put a pin in it and be able to come back to it.
Sure.
But here is my argument, and it's based on this experience we've had all these years. And that is that humans, under the right circumstances, have extraordinary capacities for forgiveness and kindness and love and generosity. And that if you put us in networks of people where we have to, look at each other, break bread together, hang out, learn a little bit something about each other. And if And inside of those networks, there are reputational costs to bad behavior, right? So in other words, I mean, that's one of the things that community does for you is that you want to continue to maintain your relationship. You want to, honor the people you're in a relationship with. And when those circumstances exist, I people are extraordinary. We really are. And we see the most amazing things happen between people who we would never expect it to happen to, if those circumstances exist. And the problem is, increasingly, they are not existing. The face-to-face community of people who owe each other something, I've been surprised and amazed through the years how reciprocal humans are in our kindness to each other. It's just amazing. You just do some small act of kindness towards someone, they're going to go out of their way to keep being kind back to you. And so to me, the tragedy of our circumstances is that we kind of don't know ourselves all that well. It's like I would ask those aliens if they could maybe provide a human operating system 101 manual to all of us, and we could study up just a little bit, because it's also equally predictable what happens when you put humans in circumstances where they're feeling under threat, under siege, not safe, attacked, and those are the circumstances that our public square is now building for us all around us, and I think you can feel it every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's something about human connection that is irreplaceable.
It is. It
Yeah.
is, and it can't be. That's why we don't think this can be fixed, digitally. It has to be like where we live our lives.
Yeah.
We have to make some space for each other.
Yeah. As I was thinking about that question, I kept on going back to jazz. If we could play like a live rendition of Louis Armstrong's La Vie en Rose, that would convince any creature in the entire universe that we are worth saving, you know?
That is so great. And in fact, that's a way better answer than mine.
No,
It is amazing what we can do, isn't it?
it is. It is. One time I was in the car with my oldest kid, and Ella Fitzgerald's "How High the Moon" came on, another live rendition of that song, and Savannah must have heard that recording because she knew every single note, every utterance of the, because there's an extended what do you call it? What do you call it when they make up words? Why again? I'm like, my brain is just not working. You you know what, the scat, the whole, there's a
Oh,
scat.
see, I wouldn't have gotten that one.
Yeah, there's a scat
Yeah.
that Ella does that, and Savannah knew every single note.
Booby, booby.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So that's when I looked over and I said, there is transcendence. I'm getting chills just remembering it. But okay, but I like your answer too. That we'll submit that for the for consideration. Okay, so the history of Village Square. What was the actual impetus when you said, okay, this is a thing, and we got to do this thing?
So I volunteered in a number of political campaigns, and I think I increasingly came to believe that things were just broken. And so watching local events with that in mind, we in Tallahassee, many, many moons ago, we had a public disagreement about whether to buy into a coal-fired plant that was potentially coming in to town. And it took on characteristics that I just kept watching what was happening and thinking, this is broken and this is not the way this is supposed to work. And the characteristics were, it became like I mean, really, in some ways, what our politics are now. It was a mudslinging fight with, ad campaigns on that were sort of silly, didn't really get to the grist of the decision that we had to make as a community. And at the same time as that was happening publicly, um, I was around a group of local leaders who had very different opinions on the coal plant, but they were having these beautiful discussions about it. Deep, rich, this is the way I think this will play out. These are the things I believe to be true. And they would engage with each other and, around real disagreement. And sometimes it would even be heated, but it was real and there was real information. And I kept watching the public debate vis-a-vis that private conversation that I, got to hear some of. And I just kept thinking that this is the conversation that the whole community should be having. And we didn't start the Village Square until after that debate was over. It went to referendum. But we modeled, like, our first season of the Village Square programs were it was called America's Energy Future. And we ended that series of 4 dinners that we had with some of the people pro and con that coal plant up on stage. And they let me, actually, I think I have the picture behind my head here. It's a reproduction of The Usual Suspects movie.
Oh.
They let me take pictures of them and we photoshopped them into the movie poster. And they were the usual suspects on coal or something like that. And so that was how the Village Square was born. And I also remember the very first dinner program that year. And that was, we talked about nuclear energy. And Corey, I swear, I had this idea, built out the organization, founded a nonprofit, got a board together, did all this work. And there we were with the first dinner, and there were 150 people in a big, huge room. We had a stage. We had people who really disagreed with each other on nuclear energy. And I'm standing there looking at the room, and then it suddenly dawns on me, we are never going to make it through this. We're going to be in the newspaper above the fold tomorrow, and there will have been a fight that broke out. And I just remember this sort of sense of abject panic. But it didn't happen. And it never happened because we accidentally did the things that put humans in proximity to each other in a way that's positive, that they can see each other's humanity. And that's what we keep doing. And that's what we should be doing all the time to counteract the really terrible relationship we have with each other without that proximity.
I've heard you say a few times, people are hard to hate up close.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. They
Yeah.
are.
Well,
Because you can see their good intentions, I think, up close. Even if you think they're just completely wrong.
yeah.
You can see their intentions are good. You can see some things about them that you relate to, even if you don't relate to the political opinions.
Yeah. Well, that's what the anonymity and the separation of digital engagement doesn't afford us, right? There are no stakes and there are no consequences, you know?
That's exactly right. And it becomes almost by virtue of the scale that we're operating in, it becomes impossible to see people in their true dimensions, right? We see them as caricatures of a political opinion and completely two-dimensional. We hollow out all the richness that exists.
Yeah.
And it's almost hard not to do it because we're dealing with human relationships at a scale that we've never had to manage. In fact, one of my favorite things I've learned over the years is now I'm going to forget. I'm going to have a moment like you had.
You're welcome.
Dunbar is one of the things I have learned that I really love the concept of is Dunbar's number. I don't know if you've ever heard of
No.
that, but Dunbar was a British anthropologist who started to notice how many times human groups seem to sort of cluster in 150 is the
150.
Number.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are different breakoffs. I think 50 was one, 85 was another, and 150 was another.
Yep.
And it's anthropologically, it
Mhm.
repeats anthropologically to this very day.
Yeah, and So to me, I think that he is putting his finger on something that's very important about humans. And that is that so we can have about that many relationships that are real relationships. Well, what do we do when we're called upon in our work, in our civic life, in every way to have way more relationships like that? Is we no longer we're no longer dealing with each other in sort of the human superpower realm where we do pretty well by each other. We're dealing with each other in a very different way. So I've come to really believe that that is an important thing, and that reviving, like, in my business, it's you want to revive a group of people who are connected with each other and very different,
Yeah.
very different. And if our communities were filled with those kinds of gatherings, those kinds of groups of people, we'd be looking at a really different political life right now, because people who would want to divide us, Amanda Ripley calls them conflict entrepreneurs,
Right.
and Debbie Lynn Molyneux, who helped co-found Bridge Alliance, prefers conflict profiteers, which I really like.
Yeah.
Um, conflict, people who want us to hate each other, um, have fertile soil when we simply don't know each other, right? When we know each other, that changes. When even one person, like even having a really close relationship with one person who really disagrees with you politically, it's changed my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I got to ask this before we get even deeper into this. Was there ever a time at a Village Square event when you got people from various sides together and it went completely sideways?
So yes. Um, so I'm trying to think of the best examples of that. So I would say anytime it ever goes sideways, it's because we didn't do our homework in connecting the people who were involved in the program enough to each other. That
Right.
makes sense. So like when I'll give you an example of how we try to prevent things from going sideways, and I'll give you an example of when they did go sideways. Um, and again, the human superpower to be able to, we get a small number of people together who are kind of the core of what a program is. Sometimes that's a panel, sometimes it's a table, whatever. Humans are incredibly capable of connecting to all the people that we pull together. We were doing a program on immigration in the middle of the rise of the Tea Party. And when there were town halls specifically on immigration that were getting violent, it was getting bad. And there was even one locally that definitely went south. And so we were trying to figure out how to put this panel together. And the liberal leaning rabbi of a local temple who was on our board was going to be the facilitator. So we started by saying, we need to find someone who either they're going to really get along well, or they already know each other to be on this panel together, because we were a little afraid of what was going to happen, right? And so we finally invited Senator Rubio's general counsel. And, Tallahassee is the Florida state capital. So Senator Rubio was once State Senator Rubio. And we invited his general counsel to be our first guest on the panel. And we did that because the rabbi and the general counsel were in the same fantasy baseball league together.
Okay.
And they completely disagreed on immigration.
Yeah.
But we knew that once we grounded that disagreement in, if you hang out with anybody who does fantasy baseball, it's like you kind of go, good grief, these people. And so I knew we had nailed it. I'm going to say that again because you're going to have to cut that out. So I knew that we had nailed it once we had that kind of disagreement with that kind of connection. And when it goes south is when we haven't quite nailed it and we didn't make that fundamental connection. And so an example is that our God Squad is now we're now in year 14 of our God Squad program, which is just one of the favorite. I
I was
love
waiting.
them.
I was waiting for you to tell me that Father Tim and Rabbi Stephanie just like they had to have like a cage match and just like really pound it out, fight it out or something. Could you imagine?
No, that they did not.
No, they did not. I'm
Ever,
just kidding.
ever.
Obviously, I'm kidding.
Yes, but actually we had a new regular God Squad member come in, and I was just super busy with stuff. And so we didn't do the pre-meetings that we normally do where we get to know them as humans, and the new God Squad member gets to know each other, I mean the other members. And we had some difficulties for a while simply by virtue of not doing, we call it our core catalyst model, but doing that sort of, if you have a diverse core of people who can see the humanity in each other, they can carry a whole room full of 100, 1,000 people along, because it's actually amazing. Like, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes all these years, I wouldn't believe it. And that's on me, right? That I think that if I had not just assumed that it would go fine, then I think that the better angels of their nature would have taken over immediately if we had just done the thing we knew we were supposed to do.
Was that a sneaky little promo for Braver Angels?
Well, I believe I am fan number one.
Yeah, yeah.
Braver Angels. I got the opportunity to see David Blankenhorn, David Lapp, and Bill Doherty, kind of cook this thing up. John Roush was actually at some of the early
Awesome.
meetings too.
That is
So
awesome.
that was one of the joys of my life, because I think it's a beautiful program.
Well, speaking of another text that I think should be studied, whether it's in book clubs or actually as part of a curriculum, is Mani's book from last year. I never thought of it that way.
It is an extraordinary book. I've been so busy that I keep thinking, I really want to write a book. I mean, this is actually ridiculous. I keep thinking, I really want to write a book. And what is it going to be about? And I have all these different ideas. I kind of wanted to write John's book. Can you imagine what a terrible job I would have done writing John Roush's book?
Yeah,
And when Moni wrote her book, I it was just amazing.
yeah,
She's just so wise and wonderful and correct, and she loves people who disagree with her politically,
yeah,
and can see them.
yeah. So absolutely. And when I read that book, there were so many things from doing the work that we do on the other show that I had been arriving at, but hadn't been able to fully articulate the way that Mani did. And then she just obviously expounded on it so much more. And I've, what's the word for it? I, I would say I've gone so far as using duplicative language, but I've shamelessly stolen her ideas because they are very practical and implementable.
They
Uh,
really are
so so
insightful, and she just nails it.
yeah, she really does. So I need to ask you to help us diagnose some of the problem. Um, in particular, in what ways has social, we talked about social, we touched upon it a little bit. Has social media, how has it messed up the concept, the original concept of the village square?
Wow, that is a great question. Because weirdly enough, so Facebook existed when we started. When were they founded? It was right
It
about
was right
the
about that time, but it wasn't what it was now. The like button didn't come in until a couple of years after
yeah.
2006, right?
Yeah, and because I remember setting up our first Facebook account, and back then it was a real boon. It did help us get our word out. It was wonderful. And over the years it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And now, I mean, we have someone on staff who's really good at knowing how to navigate it. But the truth is that without that, it's kind of squishing all it's replacing all of the relationships and the foundational geographic connectedness that we need to be healthy. It makes it so, I mean, for us to get like the word out, about events we do, we have no choice but to use social media, and it because those attachments that existed before it no longer do. It swallowed it. And then also, it does, I mean, the like button, it punches our the tribal nature of humans. And it's just who we are. It's not those other people. It's all of us.
Yeah, it's all
It's
of
all
us.
it's all of us.
So, do you think there are ways a social media platform can change in order to be more conducive to that ideal, to a more ideal way of connecting with each other across our differences?
Well, I sure hope so. But I guess at this point I worry not, because I mean I do think that there's been real efforts made. Um and to me I think that in the same way that in the same way that we all know that if all we ever ate was chocolate cake and jelly beans, that we would not be healthy humans. Um to me there should be some sort of kind of, I tease it, it's like a depolarize me button, that that it specifically shakes up what we see and what's in front of us, so that we're challenged and invited. um but I also think that the part of the problem with that is that, again, going back to my um human nature 101 operating manual that I would really like us all to have, is I think we don't know ourselves well enough to know that we need that. So it's not going to be something we volunteer for. I think, I fear. And so I think just the nature of the beast is such that I'm not sure it's going to we're going to find our way out through them.
I will push back on that a little bit. It's not
I
necessarily my
hope
place
you're
to do
right.
so, but what you just made me think of is I was thinking of something else before. Honestly, like if I had to confess, I would confess that I can be an eliminationist if I'm pushed. you know,
I think all humans can be,
yeah.
right?
I mean, I've wondered whether there should be something like a driver's license for free speech, and then some folks who abuse their privilege get their free speech license taken away. But
Right.
in all sincerity, what you made me think of was, I think it was the Solzhenitsyn quote, and loosely translated, it's the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being, right? So ultimately, I mean, not to make not to breathe too much profundity into one little Twitter post or what have you, or Threads post or Instagram post, but we're all responsible for injecting us, for being, being the kind of person we want our culture to be, for our neighborhood to be a certain way. We got to be a part of that, right? And
Yeah.
participate in that way that we wish it was. So
And
yeah,
so do you feel like there's a way that social media can help us get there?
I don't think corporately, because ultimately what we'd be doing is deferring to some higher power to create the structures for us, and then to save us from our worst selves, as opposed to create. I don't know. You're asking the likes of uh, the likes of Elon Musk or Zuckerberg, or the heads of these huge global companies, to be the equivalent philosophically and civically as Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Like, I just don't. I think that's too much of a leap. So ultimately, it is what it is. But I can behave in such a way that I know I'm edifying that little small circle around me, you know, and I reserve the right to add my own amendments, my own Bill of
Yeah.
Rights, if you will. For example, when I got onto Threads, that's a relatively recent development. I decided, you know what, I'm going to be a little bit looser and quicker to block people. Like, I don't need to silence them, but they don't need to be in my room. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
my virtual room, if you will. And that's okay, I think. For now. I might change my mind on that and open the doors wide open, but I think for now I'm having more sane, civil, even loving conversations because we're not being filibustered by the screamers and the extremists,
Yeah.
you know?
And I think you're hitting on something really important there, that there is it's really easy to feel like the situation we're in is one that we have absolutely no control over. But how we're handling ourselves in this environment is everything.
Yeah.
It's everything. And we can, create exactly what you described. And something else that you touched on, actually, before I say it, something else that I thought you said that made me think of some things is that my grandpa was a very busy pediatrician, and he raised a whole town of children for decades and decades. And he had this habit of write it was always a half piece of paper, and it had his Thomas Jackson Diseases of Children letter ahead on it, and his secretary must have typed it, and then he signed it, Grandpa. And he sent me that exact quote that
Oh,
he mailed it to me. I asked him something about human beings and something big and philosophical. And, we didn't have the internet then. And he sent me a half piece of paper back that had that quote on it. And I will never forget that.
um,
And it's just so true. Um, and I think that what you talked about, sort of the difference between, these the tech entrepreneurs, and they can't really be Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and James Madison. I think that one of the things that I see repeatedly, that's kind of a weird thing, observation I've made over the years. I think there's kind of a have you heard the concept weird? Western educated,
oh,
industrial, rich democracies.
yeah,
John Haidt talks about it in
yeah.
his Righteous Mind. Um, and I feel like I've seen 2 decades worth of weird people. Um, and we're both weird, lots of education, lots of thinking, lots of learning how to fix things, etc. Um, uh, being a little blind to human nature, being a little optimistic about who we are in our DNA. And I riffed on that optimistic view of humans that we've seen over and over again at the Village Square. But you to be able to get the to that place where humans are doing right by each other, you have to kind of understand what the DNA default setting is. And so you have to put us in certain environments. You have to support that sort of relational glue. And I think our framers understood that. They structured a civic system that put us in proximity with each other across disagreement, because they knew how we rolled. And so I think there's a thread of these weird, in quotes, humans, that we see things instrumentally. We think we can fix things. We just sort of have this, and you saw that in the revolution that launched a lot of these companies. Oh yeah, we're going to connect with each other. It's going to
Right.
be great. And you can look back on it now and think, wow, they missed an important thing, because it could still be great. It's just that we have to factor in the ways that we're going to go off track predictably.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously social media isn't the cause, but it's certainly exacerbating some of
Yeah.
the partisan divide. You know, what do you think some of the other causes are?
Um, it's weird. Sometimes I think that we all arrive to fix this challenge about a decade or more too late. Because I do think that one of the things that I have come to have a lot of empathy for is is specifically conservatives who are making their way in our public conversation, and how difficult it is for them. And I think I see that sort of on a small scale, because I think, I just explained, um, you know, weird. And I think that people who are liberal tend to run a little bit more weird.
Yeah.
And and I think we don't understand very well what conservatives are thinking and worried about. In some ways, they're worried about some of the very things we're talking about, right? Is the dissolution of the relational glue, that is happening. I love the concept of the little platoons in society. They're concerned about that, and I think there are a lot of things that conservatives are right about, and I think they come into um, this, the public square, whether that's, the conversation, in America's newspapers, or whether that's the village square. And I think that they feel pretty assaulted, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
People think the worst of them very quickly. And if you listen to, our public conversation, um, I understand why they would extract themselves from it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think that, even 20 years ago when we started, it was just there had been a fair amount of extraction that had already happened. And when which meant that those those diverse views were not, enthusiastically engaged in our civic conversation. And it also means that, and it's a sort of an understandable thing to do, with the rise of a conservative media, you're finding another place to gather and talk, and like-minded groups grow more extreme in the direction of the majority view. And you can see that on the right, and you can see it on the left.
Yeah.
um, where if you insulate yourself from that check against your human fallibility, your limited view, um, and surround yourself by people who see things the same way you do, your group grows more extreme. And so I think that we're now in a civic environment that's being dominated by groups that have circled the wagons and see each other as a threat.
Yeah.
And those are all really normal things to do if you feel under threat. And now they're just working off of each other, escalating back and forth, equal and opposite reactions. The more endangered I feel, the more my behavior um, is aggressive, the more you feel endangered, and wash, rinse, and repeat.
Right. No, so this isn't terribly scientific, but I can give you a quick story on my own experience. Um, did I just freeze up there? I'll say that again. Uh,
Yeah.
okay. So this isn't a scientific survey, but I could give you a little quick story on my own experience. I remember it might have been the late 80s, but it's certainly by the early 90s, I was already reading Burke and was very compelled, was watching Firing Line, and found myself identifying more with Buckley, William F. Buckley. So you could say that I was sort of a Buckleyan or Burkean conservative. But when I started listening to Rush, it was not too long after Rush came on the air and he was becoming very, very popular, Rush Limbaugh. You would think that because of my philosophical leanings, I would have been a bigger fan of Rush. The thing is, growing up in my family's all from New York. I grew up in Central Jersey. I was surrounded. My family, a lot of my friends were very liberal, and my reaction wasn't so much to what he was saying as much as the way he was describing my family and my friends. And I had an antipathy for it for that reason. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
so, but and to your point, I think what that did is his content. Someone like Rush and then Fox News shortly thereafter in the early to mid '90s didn't so much persuade those and expand a circle as much as it seems to have given the choir, if you will, something to go ahead and cheer for. And sound bites versus paragraphs, also something, a concept that you discuss. Sound bites that are easily repeatable. It was a scalable model of
Yeah.
partisanship, right? But I do find it interesting that fast forward to the last couple of years, or even just this year, frankly, um, and a few scholars that would also identify as left of center have given the most robust arguments against what we would call cancel culture. And that being Greg Lukianoff, who was Haidt's collaborator on coddling of the American
Yes.
mind, and now was a collaborator with a student of Haidt's on the canceling of the American mind. And then just about a month before their book was released, Yascha Mounk on the identity trap, on identity politics. So I
You're
think,
definitely citing so many of my heroes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think it's incumbent upon us to be reflective of those, for lack of a better word, that we would consider in our own tribe. Like we're the ones who can develop the antibodies for our family and our friends. You know,
Yes.
we're not going to have somebody that we already see as an enemy, let alone an adversary or even a loyal opposition, wagging their fingers at us and think that we can be persuaded. So, so that all that to lead up to a question: what do you think? And we've already been talking about this, but what do you think some more of those antibodies are? What are some of the cures? Not that we can, again, it's not a big solution that we can't snap our fingers, it's all going to be cured. But what are some of the antibodies that we can begin to solve some of these problems, even if it's just on a personal or even local level?
Yeah, so I really deeply believe, way more than I did when we started the Village Square, that it ultimately is going to be in hometowns between people who can know each other. That this problem gets solved. It's not like that. I mean, there's a lot of legislative thing that needs to happen too. But I think that if we were to really isolate where the roots of it are, it's there. Where if the way I lead my life involves people who don't see it my way, who, we may disagree on politics, but our kids are on the same softball team and we hang out, the kind of cross-cutting relationships that can be very powerful. I think that I think it's kind of counterintuitive to think that that's where the solution lies, but I really think that a fair amount of it does. It's not going to fix everything, but I'm not sure that we're going to get to a new place unless things start changing in how we lead our lives, how we spend our time. We had another of my all-time heroes is Dr. Robert Putnam, and we hosted Bob. He says his friends call him Bob, so I can now call him Bob. Um, and Shaylin Romney Garrett, his co-author on the book The Upswing, which is just another beautiful, beautiful book. And I think that describes what we need to be doing with each other. And and that is that we need to be gathering. We need to, that there we also screened a film about Bob's career called Join or Die. Beautiful film. And I think it'll be out in theaters at some point in time. That talks about how America, Americans historically, we have been joiners. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to America, he observed that, if we weren't going to have a king, we recognized that we had some responsibility in the matter. We needed to kind of show up and try to make things happen. Americans uniquely did that. And then with the evolution of the differences in how we relate to each other and the internet, we just kind of stopped joining. We stopped being a part of groups. And when we are a part of groups, we're a part of groups that hate the other group, right? Negative partisanship that, that we're mostly about how much we dislike those other people. And so we stopped doing what foundationally, it doesn't just solve the polarization problem. It helps us be a part of things in a real way in our lives. And Shaylin had a beautiful quote during our program where she just sort of said, we're going to have to do this, and it's going to be at the expense of some of our time. There's going to have to be some of our time that we just say, you know what? I haven't hung out with people who are different than me for a week. I'm going to go do something. I'm going to stretch. And I think that that's a deeply foundational part of what we can be doing what we see over and over again just it changes you. It
Yeah.
changes you. Um, and if we were working on, if I could wave a magic wand and in communities across the country, we were gathering, I don't know, once a month with people who are really different than us, and we're building a home for Habitat for Humanity. We were we were delivering Meals on Wheels, with a group of people. We were doing something that made a positive contribution, but we were doing it side by side. That is, the social psychologists teach us that kind of common goal, not on something political, but on something. One of my favorite videos is Heineken Worlds Apart ad where they build a bar together. You seen
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
And it's because we see it all the time. If you can just do something shoulder to shoulder with someone who's not like you see their humanity, and it changes everything.
It changes everything. Um, yeah, it certainly does. So I'm often frustrated in individual conversations because there are certain obstacles, and part of it is just the disposition of the individual I'm speaking with. The disposition is more defined by yeah, but as opposed to yes, and. It's
Mhm.
more defined by a transactional contest as opposed to a relational connection, right? And we could still relationally connect even if we're different. And that's what you're describing in building a barn together. I was thinking of Daryl Davis as he plays music. Music is a really great metaphor, but it's also a great exercise because every single participant is doing something different. There's the drums who's laying down the groove. There's the bass that's the musical extension of the groove. There's the guitar or the piano that's setting the musical context. There's a horn player who's telling the story, or maybe a vocalist who's telling the story. They're all completely different, but they're participating in the same composition, and they're totally free, but within the context of that composition. Yeah.
Yeah. And it wouldn't be the same if there were just all drums, or, it
Yeah.
the beauty of it comes from the differences between them, and to your point, the fact that they're engaged in this common activity. It's weird because I think sometimes it's really easy to think that the solutions to our problems lie in having a really good factual discussion about some policy or difference and seeing if we can land the plane, right? Seeing if we can somehow agree on it. And where marginally there's some of that would be good.
Sure.
I think that we're heading the wrong direction with that, because a healthy America with 325 million Americans in it is going to be a place where will perpetually be disagreeing.
Yeah.
And that in some ways we are becoming stronger and better through our disagreements, because we can see things more broadly, and agreeing is just not, it's not a final destination. It won't ever be, right? um it can't. That's kind of, it's the final destination for, if you're thinking in eliminationist kind of way, right?
Yeah.
We're going to
Yeah.
decide on that, and then all you folks are going to go away. But we have there's 325 million different ways to lead a life and to become yourself, and to relate to the world and to understand things. And we want to live in a place where we appreciate that richness and that depth and that difference. I know that I rarely learn that much from people who agree with me. It's those moments when I connect some dots with people who really disagree with me that my brain starts to explode.
Right. Absolutely. So, speaking of people that you disagree with, how do you convince folks that are, many of whom just in Tallahassee, let alone the entire country, are in very, very different silos, watch different TV shows, watch different, or get their news from different sources, go to different churches or don't go to church at all, listen to different music. Uh, how do you convince folks that are completely different silos to come out to the kinds of events that Village Square puts on, where they know that the quote unquote enemy will be there?
So it is hard. It is the hardest thing that we do. And in fact, one would think that the hardest thing that we do is to get people who are that different to see each other, respect each other, maybe even like each other, but certainly hate each other less, right? That feels like a real lift, right? That isn't a lift at all when you can get a tailwind out of human nature when we're together, common goals and a positive interaction. It's amazing how easily that happens. It's getting them in the room together. It is getting them in proximity to each other, because that is what people do not want to do right now for reasons that I understand. And so one of our core models, and the way that we do this, but it has gotten, in fact, harder. I mean, in fact, the more that all of us are recognizing that, when we started 20 years ago, I kind of had to convince people we had a problem. No more. No one needs to be convinced. But one would think that it would get easier to get people into the room to sort of, engage with each other, because people realize just how dangerous the situation we're in now is. But in fact, it's harder. And so the way that we have done that through the years, and we've gotten pretty, it's become a formal part of how we do what we do in these big, community gatherings. We build them with our core catalyst model, which I mentioned before, where we start in any endeavor with a small group of people, very thoughtfully constructed, who wouldn't normally find themselves working on something together, but who have some sort of relational glue. And so we build it very much like the panel that I mentioned, where we find one relationship across the difference where there's some glue, and then we sort of build it from there. And so we started focusing on race-related division as well as political division after the Trayvon Martin tragedy, and we're in Tallahassee, it felt very close and something we had to take care of. And so we had this big project that we launched called Local Color. And we were incredibly intentional. Like, the harder the lift, and we, perceived that doing this race-related work was going to be a hard lift, the more intentional you have to be to building that core of people who trust each other, see each other across differences. Then it's almost like growing the rings of a tree out, how as a tree ages, it gets bigger and bigger, and you can see the levels. And so after we get sort of a small core, we go to a slightly larger core, and then to a even larger core. And we do that, repeatedly for big projects that we have. And we found it to be really successful, because then anybody who engages can see a relational core in what they're doing. They see people they trust, and feel less under threat, feel less like they're engaging with the other, and some people who are with them are doing it. And then it's actually not that hard after that,
Yeah.
getting them in the room.
Getting them in the room. I would imagine that's the biggest hurdle.
Mhm.
So, speaking of getting folks in the room, you get some pretty impressive folks in the room. We talked about some of them today. Robert Putnam, Jonathan Haidt, Monty Guzman, Daryl Davis. I could go on for about a half hour on all the impressive people. I have guest envy with you.
Well, right back at you, Corey.
Thank you. But how do you have any secrets? I'll be happy to share mine. It's basically beg, borrow, and steal. But
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, and so because we were one of the few organizations early on. There were, I don't know, 5 or 10 when we started that did this kind of work. And so I think that people, academics, thought leaders who were, were also wondering about how to do this. There weren't that many choices. So I'd say the fact that you're coming in a little bit later and you're able to get the quality of guests that you've gotten is more impressive. So, that was probably about 5 years into our work. I read a New York Times column that John Haidt wrote, and I was like, oh my gosh, that is extraordinary. I love what he is saying. And we put ourselves out there, say what we're trying to do. And it's amazing how many people have been kind to me as a stranger and then have become friends.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and you know, it has really just been an extraordinary privilege to be able to keep company with just some amazing, amazing thinkers. And actually, you had mentioned doing this chat with me, and one of the things that finally persuaded me is that our following this episode will be but we'll have John Haidt again. So
Oh,
this
yeah, that's right.
and then after that, we're gonna play a throwback episode from Bill Bishop, who wrote the book The Big Sort, why the clustering of like-minded America is tearing us apart. And those two um, gentlemen were some of my first learnings about how we do what we do. And I still have a stack of both of those books. And when I go into meetings that are important to me, when new staff come on, they get a copy of both of those books. And now, we've added John Rausch,
Yeah.
Constitutional Knowledge, and Todd Rose, Collective Illusions.
Oh man. Yeah, absolutely.
Uh, and
That's actually a great practice, is just to collect copies of some of our favorite books. David Brooks's recent one, How to Know a Person, would definitely go right at the top of that list as well. But Todd Rose's work, John
yeah,
Rausch's work, Pete Wayner's work,
Pete, yeah,
Monty Guzman's, of
yes,
course.
yes.
There's so many good ones. Oh man.
And so,
Um,
yeah, speaking to why we should save the species from the aliens.
I was going to get back to that. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, give them a copy of How to Know a Person by David
Yes,
Brooks, and I think they'll, especially that
I,
chapter that gets me every time I even think about it. How to
I,
be
I
with, oh,
yeah.
sorry, how to be with a person in their pain, you know, because it's all well and good to laugh, and we laugh anyway. We laugh in our pain and in the hard times, but how to be with someone in their pain, that was such a, I'll never forget that chapter in particular. But okay,
We had a program based on his How America Got Mean Atlantic piece recently.
oh
God
wow,
Squad talked about it. Just the thinking, just extraordinary thinking he does. It really is just amazing. So
yeah.
you need to be sure to tell him that we think that he's going to save us from the alien invasion.
Next time I talk to him, and I told him when I've been reading his stuff for 15, 20 years, and when we finally met, it was such a thrill. But because we talked about that one chapter, I ended up crying my eyes out at one point. Um, and I told him at the end, after we finished recording, I said, I can't wait to see you again. I really hope that we get to talk again. And I promise next time I won't cry, but he was very gracious about it.
Well, that goes right along with one of the best podcast episodes I've ever heard. And the
Oh,
other one is yours too, which is Pete Wayner and John Roush paying
together.
a tribute to their dear friends.
Yeah, Mike Gerson and Tim Keller. Yeah, that was a great conversation.
If people want to transcend, they need to listen to that episode
Oh man.
of
Well,
talking politics and religion.
I should say this, that John and um, John in particular, but also Pete especially, they're not. Speaking of not being transactional, we talked about some tough stuff. We got into the thick of it, and they're like national, if not world-renowned figures. And I'm just some schmuck from Jersey, but because we got into some tough issues, they both followed up with me individually. They said, "Hey, Corey, how you doing, man? I wanted to follow up with you." Like, they're very human and they're very
Yes.
thoughtful, and they're not just some bigwigs that just sit in their ivory tower. They're very human and caring. So shout out to our pals Tim and John and Pete. They're very special people, as are so many of the folks that you have on Village
They,
Squarecast.
yeah, they really are. And I think that I think you're hitting on um just that they are deeply involved in human relationships and not in transacting. Another book that I'm reading right now in preparation for for another program we're doing this spring is Alexandra Hudson, The Soul of
Oh,
Civility.
yeah,
And she speaks, I mean, what you see in those two gentlemen in their relationship um with each other, and it's people who humanize each other, who deeply are deeply reverent towards who other people are as well. And I just think we live in a culture that is just so self-focused right now, and it's tragic because we don't see that it's not making us happy.
yeah, yeah. Can you hear my dogs? Is that coming through?
Only slightly, but not bad.
Okay. Um, uh, so a couple last questions and then we'll wrap up. One is, by the way, you will, if you haven't read Soul of Civility, Alexandra's book, you're going to absolutely love it. I think it is also, she did so much homework, so much preparation, interviewed so many profound people, uh, prominent people that are doing great work in this field. And she studied the history of how we engage with each other. It's a really,
Beautiful, beautiful book.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
I'm maybe about a third to a halfway through, and I'm just constantly going, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful to you for having written this
yeah,
book.
yeah. She did a lot of great work for all of us to benefit from. Do you have any questions for me?
Oh,
I didn't get to. I didn't tell you I was going to ask you that.
um, yeah, I would have a way better question probably if I want to know what you, Corey, think of this moment that we're in terms of the challenges, in terms of the hope that you see. I would love to get your sense of it.
I see a lot of anxiety because a lot of us are having trouble. This is going to sound cliche, but a lot of us are having trouble living in the now. We're thinking way too much about what could happen, whether
Mhm.
it's a year from now or even a few months from now. We're also spending a lot of time um, in rehearsing what's happened leading up to this moment and rehearsing for these imaginary conversations that often never actually happen except for some rhetorical grenade that we fire off in a very self-indulgent way.
Yeah.
But I think that if we can, there's another great quote, I'm going to totally mess it up, but the intersection of time with eternity is the present. So if we can live in that transcendence of this moment,
Yeah.
we'll be able to derive much more out of that other human being that's in front of us, right? We'll be able to, and in a way, it kind of gives us a clearer perspective of what's actually happening right now, you know,
Does.
on a day to day or even moment to moment basis. So it, in a similar way, it is where many of us have a proclivity to think on a much larger scale than what we can actually do anything about. You know, the way our politics has become national as opposed to
Yeah.
much more local. So I think that there's something to be appreciated in one conversation, one connection at a time, and the profundity of what that can do. You know,
That
I
is
don't know if that
beautiful.
necessarily directly answers your question, but
No, it,
that's,
it really does. It's beautiful, and I think that you nailed it. And I think that we have way more agency than we understand.
yeah,
We're all being herded along by these dynamics that are controlling us, and we're not living our lives that are right in front of us with the
yeah,
people who are with us.
right, right,
And it will make us happier. It will make our civic body politic healthier, and it will make it so that when people who want to gain office or make money dividing us won't have any they will know each other well enough that there's nothing, they can't do it. There's no ground there anymore. And that can be literally one relationship. I have foundational relationships now in my life that make it impossible for me to hate all those people because I love them.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. And it goes a step further too, where we have this delusion that, okay, so I'm in a conversation with a person and now I can completely convince them of my side, but there is something sweeter and more subtle about allowing that possibility, having the disposition that Monty talks about. And my next question is going to be inspired by Monica Guzman, of having the disposition, leaving open the possibility that you can say, "Oh, I never thought of it that way," you know.
Yeah,
And that disposition, not so coincidentally, makes you much more persuasive. You know,
absolutely.
one degree at a time, one degree at a time, but leaving open the possibility that you'll also be changed one degree at a time. So,
Absolutely. And there is no question that, when the Village Square sprung out of my experience in my brain, there is no question that I thought that I would be doing the former, which
yeah.
is, just creating an environment where people would start to understand and see things my way. I have to be honest about it. I mean, I think it was subconscious, but I have to admit to it. And there is no question that the experience has transformed me way more than I have
Mm,
transformed others.
that's great.
And for that, I am eternally grateful. I feel like a fuller, happier person. I'm less angry, I've learned things in so many different new ways, and known and loved so many people I wouldn't have cross paths with. And that's what you were just talking about, Corey, and that is what we need to do.
That's what we need to do. So the last question, it's something I can't remember if it was on the recording with Monty or not, but when she came on the show after her book came out, I asked her, because I really respect her as not just a writer but a journalist and all the work she's doing with Braver Angels. I asked her if she had any advice, how I can improve my game as an interviewer. And she gave me a lot of great advice, but one of the things she said is you can always ask somebody at the very end, is there anything I forgot to ask you? Is there anything else that you want to add? So that's my last question.
Oh, I don't think there is, because I think, it's funny because I'm used to preparing programs, right? So I'm used to, like, going through people's material and breaking it down and getting all organized and everything. And I didn't quite have time to help you out with this. And you exceeded my ability to have made it a great conversation. So I got nothing, Corey.
All right. Fair enough. Fair enough.
I got nothing.
Well, this was an absolute joy. It's always fun to hang out with you. And the only thing that would make it a ton better is if we were actually doing it in person. And I look forward to doing that real soon.
I agree. I'm gonna make that happen. I'm gonna be
Absolutely.
flying out to California sometime soon. So.
That'd be great. Well, thanks again. And let's do it again. Let's do it again real soon. I didn't write a close, so I don't know how to land the plane. Anyway, thanks again, and we'll see you real soon on the Village Square at Village Squarecast. Okay, I'm gonna hit pause. I'll clean that up. Let's see.